Hi guys, welcome back to ThinkSide. And we actually in our stream, we were learning about Stoicism and the Marcus Aurelius, the one of the or considered the last great emperor of the Roman Empire, uh, the last of the five greatest. And so, while learning about this, and specifically this video right here, Donald Robertson, he had mentioned something that kind of piqued my interest, which was he mentioned sophists, and they were a group of people that used reason and logic and argument to persuade people in a clever way. And so it wasn't always that they were correct, but they would word it in a way that made you think that it was correct, and then it would kind of confuse you, and you would just assume that what they based their argument on was correct, and then therefore what they're saying is correct as well. It's kind of like that logic fallacy. And so I looked into Sophism some more, and I started to learn a little bit about it because it sparked my interest in, from a political standpoint, in today. Right, I think it's fair to assume that a lot of practices that have been developed at some point in history has probably just continued to exist and continue to be refined until it's perfected, more or less. And so when you have hundreds of people or thousands of people practicing a certain thing and putting in their man hours to perfect something, you're conglomerately, you figure over this was so Sophism was actually developed in, I want to say, like 8 BC. uh, it was, and so anyway, you figure now it's 2022. I had to look at the date, and so that's over 2,000 years that people have been manpowered perfecting this skill. And so while looking at, I had seen that some people argue that that's kind of like what a lawyer is a great sophist, because they're constantly arguing and the court is their battlefield. But to me, it's more like politicians in general. Like, yeah, you could argue lawyers as well, but what really piqued my interest is that nothing has really changed in that sense. People have adapted or adopted this philosophy over time, and it's really no different. And so we notice with Sophism, in this case, it talks about like how it's a paid teacher, philosophy, and rhetoric. I'm reading the definition here. In ancient Greece, associated in popular thought with moral skepticism and specious, I think is how you pronounce it, or maybe specious reasoning. Okay, and then it also says a person who reasons with clever but fallacious arguments. So if you look up fallacious, which I did earlier, but we'll go ahead and look it up again, it's based on a mistaken belief. And so the idea of that is that people, so for instance, could say, you could say the clouds are in existence because sugar rises to the sky and fluffs up with water and makes a cotton candy like substance that floats in the sky. Right? That seems reasonable enough when you think of it that way. It looks kind of like cotton candy. I can see how it would make sense. And so I say this, and then I go on to say that because of this, while we go outside without a mask, we are inhaling particles of these clouds, which is then raising our blood sugar, and so we're more likely to get diabetes. Right? I make that argument based on that preset foundation. But then if you were to look more into it and you were to see, like, no, wait a second, that's not how clouds are made, that doesn't make any sense at all, then my argument that was based on that wouldn't make any sense either. But unless you were to go back and actually look more in depth into the argument, you wouldn't know any better. You would just take it for face value. And so that's pretty much what a sophist argument would be along those lines. And so we go into, I believe it was Sagittarius. Is that maybe? No, that's not it. Let's see. So anyway, yes, Protagoras. That was his name. So he was the original one, and it looks like I got it a little off. It was 490 BCE to 420 BCE is roughly when he was alive. doesn't sound like what I had written down, but that's okay. Maybe I got that wrong. So anyway, what I wanted to talk about now is about being that sophism is a thing and knowing that it's a practice that has continued to exist. I I was curious with applying it to more modern day, as I said, with politicians and how politicians do a similar thing that they give you an argument based on something that might not be true. For instance, they might say, um, "We don't. You don't need an AR-15 because you can use other weapons." And then they go on to say they base their argument of that based on that there's a bunch of shootings going on, and AR-15s, the assault rifles, are to blame, right? And then you look into the data and you see that it's mostly handguns and things like that that causes these, are the um, the tool of use for tool of choice used for these mass shootings. And so that would be another form of sophism, because they're giving you a base argument of something. They're saying like this is a fact, and then they're going on to say because of this fact this is also true, or that I believe it's true because of this fact. When you look into it, then the fact isn't true, but unless you take that time to look into it, you don't know any better. And so that's how a sophist works, right? They give you that fallacious reasoning, and then they go further. But what sophism more or less is built on is the idea that they believe that no one fact is an absolute fact. So it's more of like what you think to be real is real, right? So it's based on perception is what they say. And so they might say that like if you believe the sky is green, then if you perceive it to be such, then it is, because to you it is, right? So it's not fact that it's blue because some people don't see it as blue. So that's the idea behind it. Inherently, that sounds pretty fair and reasonable, and I think for myself, like I inherently want to agree with that, because I think that there's a lot of things that that is very much up to perception. It's the reality of the eye. It's reality is different based on the eye of of the beholder, right? And so that's part of the problem. There is that like when we start to decide on actual facts and say like no, the sky is this and this is that and whatever, it might not be to someone else, but there's a fine line with that, because you get into issues where you could say inflation is bad. We've talked about inflation before in the YouTube channel. You could say inflation is bad. It's going to destroy our economy eventually, our country. But then one could argue under sophism that nah, that's just what you perceive it to be. You just think it's bad because you think that it's true, but only for you. Meanwhile, a guy over here, maybe it's even the politician that's saying, or Jerome Powell saying, inflation isn't that bad. It's only up this amount of percent, and he could do that in an unguilty conscience, and do it with a certain kind of confidence that he's telling the truth, because in his eyes, if he believes under the sophism belief that if he believes it to be true, then he's going to he's going to tell you what he believes to be true, and it's fact because he believes it is, and so he's not lying to you, which is a really odd thing to consider. And kind of the mentality in that, but it's real, it exists. That's literally, it's under what's called rhetoric, which is kind of like the foundation of conversation and persuasion and intellectual conversation in general, like anything like that. And so philosophies, and so they say like when you look up rhetoric, they'll say that sophism and stoicism are two separate rivers that converge, and they kind of compete in some ideas, because stoicism is different in the sense that they believe that it's very specific truth. Like there's certain ways to do certain things, but Like if we go to Stoicism, and so this is a pretty interesting thing, just learning the difference between Stoicism and Sophism, and how you hear like all these different, like, here, I'll go back. You hear about all of these different, excuse me, philosophers, and you kind of lump them together, thinking like, yeah, they're all great philosophers. And I mean, that's what I did anyway. And then you start looking, okay, so like now we know a little bit about what sophist is. We go further and we look at the sophist philosophers that existed. And so we have Plato, which is a very, very known one. Like, I think everyone pretty much hears of Plato. Um, Protagoras, not so much. Protagoras, I think, is how it's pronounced. I mean, Gorgias, maybe Gorgias, I'm not sure. And then we have Prodicus. And Prodicus, I think I've heard of before, but not the other two. But Plato, you know what I mean? Like, we've heard Plato before, and we just assume like he was a great philosopher, and whatever. And he was. I mean, obviously, if he stand the test of time, and we still know about him, he's on Google. I mean, a man that existed before we started counting up, uh, has, or at least I assume, yeah, BCE, way before we started counting up, has ended up on the internet. I mean, that's a pretty impressive thing. So I would say he's definitely great at what he did, regardless of what kind of ideas were maybe false or had fallacies to them. And so now let's go to Stoicism. Stoicism is what I've kind of been more drawn to, and it's how I learned about Sophism. But it's something that we can. I don't mean to say that one is better than the other. I think they both have their purposes, and I think that um, Sophism does have an accuracy to it. Just being, like I said before, like, I think there are things that one might perceive as one way and one might perceive as another way, and it's not necessarily that it's necessarily fact. I think a lot of the things that we think are fact oftentimes aren't, and it's just what we currently know to be true. Which ultimately, if that's what it is, it means someone decided that, and if someone decided it, very well could have been to some extent based on perception, or rather, what they perceived, what they observed happening, that led them to believe that this is fact. And so it can be a dangerous thing. I'm not saying Sophism is wrong. I'm just saying that the idea to use arguments that are not all that accurate, or not as grounded in a deep truth, can cause problems, and that shouldn't be a tactic to convince someone, is by telling them something that isn't really true, and then telling them why you should do this based on something that isn't really true. That's silly. It's manipulative, really. Cool. Okay, so now that we talked about that, let's talk about Stoicism. Stoicism is the endurance of pain or hardship without the display of feelings and without complaint. So that seems pretty cold in definition, right? It seems pretty kind of like hardened and cold. But there's more to it than that. That is more. It's more of like the result, more of what you're trying to accomplish, and not necessarily what what the practice itself is, because it's like being, punching, I don't know, like being punched in the face and saying like, okay, I'm not going to display any feelings and without complaint, right? Like, so if I do that, then now I'm a stoic. Like, that's not the same thing. It's practicing certain mental habits and physical habits that allow you to embody the ability to do that, to endure pain, to endure hardship, and not worry about displaying your feelings, in the sense of you're not outwardly expressing them and letting them get the best of you. You're in check. You're aware of your feelings, and you take them for what they are. I would imagine, and then without complaint. So you're not saying like, uh, woe is me, I have to change my flat tire, or whatever. Like you understand that everyone at some point may have to do that or have some sort of hardship. Everyone endures hardships, and so you understand that that's the case, and you understand that you are no better than everyone, and so you understand that, like, okay, I have to do this, and you don't complain about it. And that can be a hard thing, and that's exactly why Stoicism exists. Is really it's like a, well, it's a philosophy, but it's a set of beliefs, or it's a system that allows you to do exactly that. Be able to not complain about it, allow you to understand that this happens to everyone, more or less. And so what do Stoics believe? So they believe that our wealth, status, power, possession, and stature are neither good or bad, and they have no social importance with respect to our relationship with one another. And so it's really cool. See, it says we are equals, and that itself kind of like fires me up, because I think that's a really neat idea. Uh, and so I think that's cool. So anyone who's like super rich, they don't look down upon them for that. They don't say like that's really, like, this person's not a very good person, or they should give it all up, or how dare they enjoy their jet flight to San Fernando, or whatever it was for Elon Musk that people were complaining about. It was like a 9-minute flight, because it costs exorbitant amounts of money. And I'm sure they talked about, like, pollution and all that stuff too. So I'm not trying to make light of it, but it's an interesting idea how we complain. I think to a point we get jealous of people who have money, and we think they shouldn't have it, that they should give it away or give it to us or whatever. And Stoics believe that excuse me, having those things, having power, having possessions that are, say gold, having really nice cars, really nice houses, all of those things, there's nothing wrong with them. They're not good, in the sense that you shouldn't seek them out as like the main goal. You shouldn't feel better for having them, because they don't make you better. You're not more good. You're not um, any different to another person just because you have those things. And so it should be looked at as separate. Like, it's okay to enjoy. There's the 5 a.m. club. I've referenced this a few times, but the character's name is Mr. Riley, and he says that we are, or actually it might have been the Spellbinder that says this, but um, he says we are spiritual beings enjoying enjoying life in a physical body, or something to that effect, and how the life wants you to have an abundance of things. There's no shortage of flowers, there's no shortage of leaves, there's no shortage of fruit, of all these things. Just as money allows you to live a very lavish life, it allows you to have and do things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, just as there's not inherently anything good with it. And they prove this, or I say prove it, they make an argument for this, saying how, this is when we were learning about Marcus Aurelius, and how his teacher argued with him about how, money is a good thing. And he had asked, like, okay, but if you give money to a tyrant, someone who's going to use that money to, buy a bunch of slaves or whatever, I don't remember exactly what he said, but use it for bad things, is that money still good? And he says, no, or whatever. And so it's the idea that if it can be used for good, but it can also be used for bad, then it's more of a tool than it is a good or bad thing. And so it's okay to have these things. It's okay to have possessions of, a Rolex on your hand or whatever. Like, it's okay to enjoy life, and to reap the rewards of your your work, the spoils of your work. That's fine. Like, that's kind of like, as the book says, it's an inevitability for serving the world, for doing something that changes or innovates the way we live life. And then it goes on to say we are equals. And again, I really like that, saying that it doesn't matter nothing matters about your status. Nothing matters about, what you've done, what you haven't done, what you have, what you don't have, what you're going to do, what you're going to have, what your parents did, or where you live. Nothing, none of that matters. Literally nothing. We are equals, period. And I think that's an important foundation to go from. I've come to really like Stoicism because of the way that this is all set up. I think it's really cool, knowing that the so yeah, because it says, like, even right here, external differences such as rank and wealth are of no importance in social relationships. And so you see the person for who they are, and you treat them as such. You respect them. You treat them as an equal. I'm sure that's not to say that you should not value some relationships more than others, because I think that's normal to. For instance, in the book, they talk about how money allows you to help the people that are closest to you. So I think it acknowledges that some relationships are going to be more valued, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one person is less than another person. So I think that's a really good point. And so this is actually the first person. Zeno of Citium is the founder of Stoicism as a school, philosophy founded by. Yeah, okay. And I believe this guy actually had started it after he crashed. He lost all of his wealth, his fortune, and ended up learning or developing this Stoic philosophy. But that may have been a different guy. Don't remember. Yeah, you've done well, fortune, driving me thus to philosophy. So I believe, yeah, ship sank along with all its cargo. And Zeno ended up in Athens, and while visiting a bookstore, he was introduced to the philosophy of Socrates, and later the Athenian philosopher named Crates, I believe is how you pronounce it. And they influenced him to the point that he developed the thinking and principles that we know as Stoicism. So I think that's really neat that he was actually impacted by other philosophers that led him to create his own form of philosophy, which is a pretty crazy thing. And so if we look into if we look into Socrates, we learn that he was a Greek philosopher from Athens. It's pretty amazing. So you think about how knowledge was back then, right? It wasn't like you could just look up on Google great philosophers or different philosophies or whatever. You couldn't do any of that. It was literally, you had to find some random book that was hand copied and hope that it was informational, that the information that you found was correct. Is good luck fact checking it. You know what I mean? What are you going to fact check it against? You have to go find someone that's an expert on it and then hope that he's correct, or find 10 other books and then hope that's correct. It was, I'm sure it was a lot of uncertainty at that time. And Zeno just happened to come across a book in a bookstore that led him to a beautiful belief system, a beautiful philosophy, that was all because he crashed his ship, or that his ship sank and he lost everything, literally all his fortune. So I think that's super cool. So yeah, that kind of gives a basic idea of what Stoicism is, and why I think it's such an important thing to learn about, being that it literally, it teaches you how to endure things that you didn't think you could endure, and to be able to do so without looking at them as such a horrible thing. And that comes down to a few different things, but I believe they teach a grander perspective. And this is something I've always said, but differently, is that when you kind of just don't worry about the little things, and look at it from a grander scheme of things. And that's pretty much what they teach, is that you have to look at yourself as kind of like a speck in the world, and how the universe is so grand and we're just a very small piece of that. And so though we are extremely significant for existing in this universe, we're also extremely insignificant, and our struggles that much less so. And so because of that, they don't really matter. Like our life is a gift and something we are here for. And so to live through it in a way that allows us to beat it, right? We beat every single struggle and we achieve beyond what we thought we could. That's kind of what Stoicism, the goal of Stoicism is to do, is to make sure we know that we can achieve everything we set our minds to. We can achieve what we didn't think we could, but these are the kind of like the steps to do so. And so going forward, we will continue to learn about them. I do appreciate the YouTube video here that I was able to record. I'll make sure to get this out to you guys, and we'll go ahead and stop the recording here, and then we're going to move into, here on the stream, we're going to move into learning more about Stoicism on a YouTube video. I haven't picked one yet, so bear with me and I'll go ahead and find one, and then we can go from there.